Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me at the MarketSite studio, we have Tom Leatherbury. He's an appellate lawyer and a partner at Vinson and Elkins with 40 years of experience in state and federal appeals and trials. He also serves as a director of First Amendment Clinic at Southern Methodist University's Dedman School of Law. Tom has regularly represented traditional and digital publishers and broadcasters in all aspects of media litigation throughout his career, including libel, privacy, and other torts, reporters' privilege, news gathering and access, misappropriation, and breach of contract sections. It is great to have you with us, Tom. Welcome to Trade Talks, and clearly something that we are interested in is being a digital and online media content provider, and thinking about the laws that are shaping or trying to shape, today's current digital environment. Explain to us what Section 230 is and the challenges that it represents in today's media environment.
Well, thanks for having me, Jill. So Section 230 refers to a provision in the Federal Communications Decency Act that's been on the books since 1995. Essentially, it provides that social media platforms, for example, can't be treated as a speaker or publisher of third-party generated content or user content. It also provides an immunity in most situations for content moderation decisions and the failure to moderate content for those social media platforms.
So really what the challenge is, if you have someone who is spreading misinformation or making comments that could open up a libel case, as an example, Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, they're not responsible for it because they're just the conduit, not necessarily the publisher or the editor.
That's right. And if Twitter or Google or Facebook removes my post, I can't sue them because they've got immunity for that too.
Now, there's a couple proposals that are coming out of Florida and Texas. They came out last year. What could the potential impact be should these go through, or even if they don't go through, what does the impact look like?
Yeah, so some of the same concerns that have motivated legislators to criticize Section 230 and the immunity provided by Section 230 motivated the legislatures in Texas and Florida to pass social media regulation laws. And those laws basically have two very troubling, unconstitutional provisions, I would say. One creates a private right of action if there's viewpoint discrimination. Anyone who feels that they have been deboosted or that their posts have been blocked or they've been shadow banned can sue as a private individual, get declaratory and injunctive relief and attorney's fees if they're successful. And so it really undercuts the immunity of Section 230 and makes it very difficult for social media platforms to enforce their terms of service, leading to the proliferation, I'm afraid, of misinformation and false information and hateful information on social media platforms. The second provision is a disclosure provision that is very intrusive and makes the social media platforms report to the state governments many things about their complaint procedures, how many complaints they've had about content moderation, et cetera, et cetera. And those laws are both in the courts right now, one's in the Supreme Court, one's on its way to the Supreme Court.
Not just specific to media law, but it really is astounding just how misunderstood the Constitution is, particularly how people interpret what the First Amendment is. And we're going to get there in a moment. And this might be some of a rhetorical question. Can a bipartisan solution ever be reached?
I'm not hopeful about that. There are many proposals from both sides of the aisle to change Section 230. Almost all of them are unconstitutional in my view, the Democratic proposals as well as the Republican proposals. So I think gridlock's there, and I think it's going to be very, very hard to reach some kind of compromise that changes Section 230 as much as the courts want to, and the courts may, since the U.S. Supreme Court has granted cert in 2 Section 230 cases this term.
How do you see the law evolving when it comes to digital and online content?
I think slowly. I mean, as you and I discussed, there haven't been many new laws since 1995 when the Communications Decency Act was passed in the infancy of the internet. There have been a couple, one FOSTA dealing with sex trafficking and online sex trafficking, of course, supplemented that. But I think it's going to evolve very slowly on the content regulation side. I think you may see more movement on the competitive side, or the FTC side, or the Justice Department side, as some of the larger platforms acquire great market power and allegedly exploit that power.
And we're always thinking about global standardization, whether we're talking about media law, whether we're talking about ESG reporting, we're always looking to standardize it in some way. Explain to us why the First Amendment creates a very unique challenge to creating a global standard.
Yes, I mean, the law about freedom of speech is different from country to country. I marvel at how global news operations like Dow Jones and Reuters deal with all the different laws, from Singapore to Poland to Russia to China to when here we're used to dealing with the First Amendment, which gives us really unprecedented freedom, and I don't ever see it becoming standardized. I mean, you talk to colleagues who teach abroad, teach media law abroad, and the focus is so different. There can be defamation cases for disparaging a group based on religion, based on race, based on, and those are defamation claims, not other kinds of claims. So I think it's a big challenge, and I don't think we'll ever get there personally.
Yeah, well, I mean, even when you think about it more locally in the U.S., I just think it's largely misunderstood. First Amendment law is not designed to moderate private companies.
Right.
So that argument kind of goes out the door. This is about the government, not private companies, public companies, whatever you want to call them. It's not to moderate them.
Right.
And that's where just to say it's freedom of speech or violating my freedom of speech, these platforms can do whatever they want in terms of moderation, in theory.
Yeah, unless you're in the Fifth Circuit, which held that the social media platforms are common carriers. And that's really one of the issues that's going to get these Florida and Texas laws to the U.S. Supreme Court, because the 11th Circuit on the Florida law and the 5th Circuit on the Texas law split as to how to analyze it. The 11th Circuit looked at it, as you were just saying, and said these are private companies. They have their First Amendment rights too. Content moderation is part of their exercise of their First Amendment rights. And the 5th Circuit said, nope, common carriers. They can't do, the law is constitutional. The Texas law is constitutional. They can't discriminate based on viewpoint. So the Fifth Circuit really, in a way, equated these large social media platforms to the government, because, as you said, the First Amendment protects individuals against government action that restricts their freedom of speech, not private companies' actions that restrict their freedom of speech.
Yeah, and that's your choice as a consumer. If you don't agree with the way a platform's being moderated, don't advertise, don't give them your data, don't be part of their active monthly user count. That's kind of how, in the corporate world, that's kind of how I guess you're regulated, if you will, with your consumer base.
By the marketplace.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Let's pivot to fossil fuel boycotts for a moment, because again, this has to deal with the First Amendment. It touches every vertical of our lives, when it comes to free speech and the impact that has with investment funds.
Oh, it's incredible. I did some publicity gathering in advance of this interview just to see what was going on recently with those laws. Essentially, a number of states have passed these laws that prohibit companies that do business with the state from boycotting fossil fuel companies. There are a lot of constitutional problems with the statute. The definition of boycott is very vague. It gives standardless discretion to government officials to determine what a boycott is. It ignores that boycotts are quintessential political activity, or expressions of political viewpoints, expressions of corporate viewpoints, that the U.S. Supreme Court recognized in Claiborne Hardware years ago. What the laws do essentially is there are two parts of it. One hits at investment funds that manage large state funds, the teacher's retirement fund, the fireman's retirement, those sorts of large investment vehicles. And it says if you boycott fossil fuel companies, we're going to debar you and stop you from doing business with the state, and we're going to divest that money and put it somewhere else. The second provision is a certification provision applicable to all government contractors, not just with the state, but with cities, that says, I will not boycott fossil fuel companies during the term of my contract. So in Texas, well, the most immediate example that's hit already is the state of Louisiana has divested $800 million from BlackRock because of its fossil fuel law. The Texas process is a little more drawn out, and it requires a list that the comptroller put out of 10 companies and 350 funds in August. Now the teachers' retirement funds and the other state entities have a chance to come in and say, no, 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 we need to invest in those because it will impact our beneficiaries of those funds. And so nothing final has happened under the Texas law, but you know, all of these laws originate in the anti-boycott, divestiture sanctions about Israel. And those laws started being passed about 7 to 9 years ago. They're all being litigated. The Supreme Court has an opportunity to review the Arkansas anti-BDS law this term on petition for cert. The Texas law is the BDS law, not the fossil fuels law, but they're the same template put out by the same group, actually. Is in the Fifth Circuit. It was argued a couple of weeks ago. So we're going to know pretty soon, are boycotts political expression or are they conduct? And can states impose these types of laws on their government contractors?
It's such a fine line because the investment funds, they have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders, and perhaps they need to invest in oil companies to get consistent returns and to get dividends, especially as people are thinking about retirement. However, there is a big shareholder mandate these days where purpose and ESG are where they want to allocate their money. So it's a lot for a manager to be able to balance that.
It is, and I pity the poor government relations people who are having to help them walk that tightrope between shareholders and regulators. You know, I think these laws are very unconstitutional because they compel speech by government contractors. They place unconstitutional conditions on government contractors in order to do business with the government. There are many vague provisions. I mean, there's a provision that says it's illegal to boycott fossil fuel companies without an ordinary business purpose. You tell me what tell me what that means. You probably could better than I could, but
when you say compel speech, is that making a government contractor feel as if they're forced to take a position?
Absolutely. It's the certification provision.
Right.
And so you simultaneously have compelled speech because government contractors have to certify that they won't boycott fossil fuel companies or Israel or gun companies. Texas also has a law about. And then there's proscribed speech or prohibited speech because the definition of boycott is broad enough to include public statements made by executives about their belief in ESG and their wanting to engage in just the mix of investments that you talked about to maximize shareholder returns.
I mean, we're in the heat of that right now. I mean, it's one of the biggest stories in financial media. Yeah. And speaking of where we are right now, I mean, you've been doing this for decades. How and I mean,
thanks.
But how has your practice evolved? What issues are most prominent? Are there certain defining moments like, okay, 2012 was really when social media hit the scene, and that's when we started talking about Section 230 more than we ever did before? Are there defining things in your timeline?
Yeah, I think there are. I mean, so if you take traditional media law, that was a lot of defamation and privacy. And the biggest defining moment in Texas, for example, was in 2011 when the legislature passed our Anti-SLAPP Act that allowed media defendants and others sued for the exercise of their free speech to file an early motion to dismiss, to avoid discovery, and to reduce the cost of the lawsuit, and potentially to recover attorney's fees from the plaintiff if the defendant was successful in its motion to dismiss. So that was huge. 1993 in defamation cases, we got to appeal denials of summary judgment motions, and that rather than go through a trial and incur all those expenses or be forced to settle. So there are some defining moments. I think anti-SLAPP is the biggest thing on the defamation front. I think on the transparency, on the government transparency front, it's harder and harder for media groups to get public records. It's a very slow process, and it's just continued to be very clunky in order to get the government records to hold government officials accountable. I think this whole trend of government compelled speech and prohibited speech is huge. I mean, at the clinic at SMU, we say, Texas, so many First Amendment violations, so little time, and it's really true. You also have a big development of journalists suing cities after mass protests. I mean, Occupy Wall Street started that trend really when there was sort of policing put under the microscope because of the way they treated journalists and photographers who were covering those events. The George Floyd protests were huge in terms of adding Section 1983 civil rights claims to journalists' repertoire because so many of them were arrested or detained or injured severely, some of them, by their, when they were doing their jobs, just covering the protests as a journalist and not. So, I mean, there are defining things. There are always ebbs and flows in a practice like that, but it's never dull.
Yeah, well, no, it is never dull. And one last question, I could talk to you all day about this, but in the realm of teaching law, as a seasoned professor, does it become more challenging if you're trying to be as centered as you possibly can and teach constitutional law, First Amendment law, and again, social and culture is evolving so fast, so whether it's coming from administration or from the students or from political pressure, is it getting harder to teach law?
I think we've been really lucky. I think the students who elect to take the First Amendment clinic come from a variety of political viewpoints, and I think, as you know better than I do, part of the core First Amendment values is you have to defend speech that you hate, but you have to defend the person's right to say it.
Right.
That's why the ACLU represented the Nazis in Skokie. It's you can name off any number of examples of lawyers who don't believe in the speech they're defending, but they believe in the right to say it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we try to teach the students. We try to represent clients from a variety of walks of life and a variety of viewpoints, so that students sometimes feel uncomfortable about where they are and about the speech they're advocating for. But that's part of the job, and it's a fun part of the job.
It is. It certainly is. Tom, we appreciate the insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks, and thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.